Welcome everyone to today's Learn at Lunch webinar. Today we will hear Extension Specialist Roger Saws discuss pasture and cropland leasing in Oklahoma. For questions, click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen to bring up the group chat box. It will appear on the right side of the screen where you can type your questions. Roger will answer questions at the end of his presentation. And for more information on leasing and other farm management topics, you can visit the eFarm Management website. I will paste a link to this in the chat box. Roger, I will turn it over to you now.
Okay, well, very good, Brent. Well, I'm going to spend a few moments this afternoon talk to you about some of the farmland rental market rates that we have determined with our surveys and also with NAS, and also some discussion regarding those rental arrangements that might work best for you. Sound like a plan? Well, I hope so. Well, a lease agreement serves as the common ground in which two parties, the tenant and landlord, they do meet, and the goal is to come up with a fair and equitable lease that is satisfactory to both parties. And so in this presentation, I'll review some of that market information that is oftentimes serves as that beginning point for discussion and negotiation. And then we'll briefly touch on the concept of cash rents and share leases and talk about some of the pros and cons associated with each. And finally, I'll pass along some online resources that will hopefully provide you, the viewer, some additional information so that you can make some better decisions. And so I'll show you some slides that will explore the recent trends and patterns in the land tenure markets. You know, what the going rental rate is in my area. That's a common question that a lot of farmers and ranchers ask about. And it is an important question to answer because researching cash rents and crop shares provide a needed background as to what's going on in the farm economy and how that translates into the ability to pay for rentals. So let's go into this slide and let's review the rental markets for cropland. So let's look at the relationship between cropland rents and land values over time. And so this is over time since 1970. The red line shows land values over time, and then the blue line shows on the rental side. There is a relationship between the earnings as measured by annual cash rents and the farmland values. And they generally move together, but that relationship is not necessarily constant. They don't necessarily move lockstep. The land value scales on the left starts at about $250 in 1970. Now it's in well excess of $1,500. The cash rent scale is on the right, starts at about $10 per acre in 1970, now at about $32. Now, I want to remind the viewers that this is available from NAS at that link shown below. And this is a composite of those cropland growing regions in the state. Could be the row crop areas as well as those small grains. And so it's a composite east, west, north, and south. And so while there's a relationship between the rental markets and the land values, they do operate on their own fundamentals. There's some relationships, obviously, but they're a little different. The rental markets are a pretty good indicator of farm earnings. Now, the ownership transfer market is also pretty reliant on those farm earnings, but they are also influenced by those non-farm factors such as recreational interest and urbanization. So stable cash rents are a pretty good thing if you're a tenant. You know, over the past several years, as shown by the blue line, it hasn't changed a whole lot. It's been bouncing, right around $30 to $32. You know, if you're a tenant, that's probably a good thing, like I said, because you can kind of bank on that stability from year to year. But it's perhaps a less good thing if you're a retired farmer or rancher wanting to earn some return on your investment. But at the same time, your land asset has been appreciating in value, and that's been adding some value and equity to your balance sheet. So let's move on down to the county level. And NAS conducts these surveys annually, but they release information at the county level about every other year. So this reflects 2019, and you can see here that the darkest shade of red really reflects those areas that are intensively in cultivation and represent your most productive cropland in Oklahoma. And so thus your expected earnings are a little bit greater and your cash rents are the highest as well. So then when we move on to the surveys and the information from Oklahoma State, we conduct surveys every other year. And we ask farmers and ranchers about questions on cash rentals as well, but we break it down by commodity, say grown. And so, for instance, this is wheat, and this reflects a survey that was done in the fall of 2018. The results are reported in Current Report 230. And according to the Oklahoma State study, dryland cash rents for wheat ground appear to have declined since the prior report in 2016. You know, rental rates once again tend to be a reflection of the farm economy. How well the crop sector income has performed and is expected to perform carries a great deal of weight on the ag real estate market, as well as those resulting rentals. And also I showed on this slide some of those state averages from that same survey conducted in years starting in 2008. You can see here that, you know, how they have trended up into mid-decade, and at least through this 2-year time frame, we've experienced somewhat of an adjustment or correction to the downside. Now, unfortunately, we can't break these numbers down to the county level like NAS does, but we can be commodity specific, and we can relate these numbers at least on a regional basis. And so then when we move along to why have those numbers sort of declined, and why are they making some adjustments? Well, it's really a reflection of the low commodity price environment that we've experienced over the past several years, notably in wheat, and those impacts on farm finances. You know, we've seen a major drop-off since the beginning of this of the last decade. And with that kind of decline, it's really not surprising that rentals have made a downwards adjustment. And you know, a budgeting process can show what a tenant can afford to pay, and many just can't pencil out as much as what they did a couple years ago. And so where cash rentals go from here really depends on those expectations, you know, going forward concerning profit margins and cash flows. And you know, while a forward contract bid of say 447, and I got that off of the futures yesterday, subtracting 20 cents for basis, sort of representative of north central Oklahoma. You know, that's better than $3 wheat, obviously, better than $4, but it's really hard to be really overjoyed about that because there's still obviously a lot of it worldwide. But in my opinion, until we're consistently over $5, until we can consistently see $5 wheat, I think we'll continue to see some weakness in the crop sector in regards to these rentals going forward, especially in the wheat growing regions of the state. So then when we move along to the pasture side of the markets, this slide looks very similar to the cropland slide, but it is a little different because the disparity between rents and values actually is even greater. We see that land values since 1970, as shown by the red line, have increased much more dramatically, nearly 1,000%, while rents have almost tripled. You know, for the first 20 years of my career at OSU, starting in the mid-'80s, I could use $8 to $10 pasture rentals for native grass, and you know, that would pretty well carry the day. And rentals really haven't changed a whole lot since about 2016, as shown by that blue line. It's right around $13.50 per acre. Now, once again, this is a composite of all the forage types and the pastures that are representative here in Oklahoma. It factors in the rangeland out west and the shortgrass prairie, and some of those improved forages or introduced pastures as we move further east. And so then when we move down to the county level, the pasture rents sort of follow a familiar pattern. They're higher in the east and lower in the west. Of course, that reflects a higher forage potential and productivity and those higher carrying capacities or stocking rates, okay? So probably no surprise there. So then when we look at it from the OSU surveys and the information that we gleaned from those surveys, we did break it out by some forage types, native pastures, east and west. Bermuda, that's pretty indicative of the introduced forages that we've seen in the state over the years. Other pastures are a composite of all the other introduced forages that we see out there. And, by and large, we've been steady despite, maybe some tight operating margins in the cow-calf sector. This is in contrast to the cropland slide that I showed you a couple minutes ago, where we did actually see some declines. Forage base gains have some added value, especially as the productivity of the forage base grows as one travels east across the state. I think pasture rents have been supported. Several factors coming into play. One of them, I think, has been supported by that continued expansion of the beef cattle herd that we saw, mid-decade, and then going into, I guess, fairly recently, that herd growth has slowed down, and I think it's peaked out at least in 2020. They deviate, from those numbers as we, move forward, but I think that's come into play where we've had some cattle producers that are looking for some additional forage base for their expansion of their herds. And then another thing that's coming into play, or has played a big factor, is the forage conditions. They've been in pretty decent shape recently over the past several years, and we've, at least currently now, we've got some adequate moisture, at least in our soil profiles, virtually statewide. But where we go to from here, I think, not only depends on those pasture conditions, maybe those feed supplies, but it's really the economic viability of the livestock industry and those resulting earnings. And it looks like the returns to the cow-calf sector might be a bit higher in 2020, and that in itself will lend some support to those pasture rentals going forward. So the bottom line here is that even though that, the reported rates are a good place to start that I've talked about, they should only be used as guides. Our quoted rates, as well as those available from NASS, are not necessarily right for your farm ground. There's a lot of personalized information that needs to be factored into every negotiation. So it's a good place to start, but I would really encourage both parties to revise those numbers up or down depending on their individual situation, since, it's very important to flush out those details. And so how do you flush out those details? What are those discussion points? And, how do you decide on what lease is best for you? Well, these are the kinds of topics that I would initiate for those discussions across the table between the landlord and tenant. These are the kinds of items and questions to ask yourself, regardless if you're a landlord and tenant. And, it really brings a sort of a base of conversation across the table. And, the leases should cover all parameters of production. What kind of lease do I go with, and which one might work the best for both parties? So let's start off with the cash lease. And this is a fairly simple one, and it's fairly straightforward. It's where the tenant does pay the landlord a fixed amount per acre per year. Essentially, the tenant bears all the price and production risk, reaps all the benefits of the managerial expertise and risk-taking. It can be a single or annual lease. It could be multi-year in duration. You can incorporate a flexible component to it depending on those market conditions. And so that's where, for instance, we can multiply the base rent by a ratio of the current year's price to a base price. The base price could be that 5-year historical average. And so if the current year's price, either at harvest or some other stipulated time frame, if that's higher than that base price, we can adjust that base rental upwards. If the current year's price is lower than that historical average, then we could lower that base rent. And so it does add some flexibility. This is not mandatory for every cash lease, but it is something to at least consider in, sort of bending with the wind, so to speak, in regards to the market conditions and the way it's blowing. So something to think about. And so there are the approaches when it comes to how do you determine a fair cash rent. Well, it's a lot of compromise, it's a lot of give and take, but there are some starting points that we really need to think about. And one is the market approach. Those are the numbers that I showed you earlier. And then you really need to think about how does that relate to the land in question. What is comparable or comparable land renting for? And so then the landlord needs to think about their cost structure and the costs that they need to at least recover. Could be property taxes, any costs associated with the improvements on land used by the tenant. They might want to add a return on their equity. And so they have their own cost structure. And then we have the tenant side of the coin. And this is the amount that that they can afford to pay. And so it's a budgeting process, an exercise that looks at those expected costs and returns with that production activity. And then we look at the expected net return, and that's essentially the maximum rent that the tenant can afford to pay. So we have two different numbers that could be miles apart, could be pretty close, but that area in between is that zone of potential agreement. And so that zone is sort of that compromise zone between those parties. And it does take some negotiation and discussion. But I think that the more that they're transparent and that they're honest and they can keep those communication lines open, I think that they can hammer out something that's satisfactory to both parties. And so I think once again, it does reflect different points of view. It does provide some transparency, and the chances are good that both parties can make an informed decision when everyone has skin in the game. There are some pros and cons with cash leases. The big, I guess, advantage is that it's the low stress option for the landlord. The only thing they essentially have to worry about is just receiving that payment. For the tenant, it does provide more incentives to get things done on a timely fashion because they're essentially calling shots. They are making those day-to-day decisions, and they have that total managerial freedom, okay? But obviously, there's some disadvantages as well. Essentially, the only risk that the landlords do face is that, well, a tenant could default on their payment. It does occur, doesn't happen a lot, but it may occur. And we have a situation where maybe we have a tenant that will overgraze or damage the land. Now, if there are provisions in that lease that address that particular issue, we can really minimize that risk. But of course, on the tenant side, we have tenants that bear all of the market and production risk. And so in really pretty tough years, they're still responsible for making that payment. Their cash flow may be jeopardized, their finances are extremely tight, but they still need to come up with that payment. Really, it could put them in a real pinch. And I would also encourage both parties to look at a cash rent in terms of changes in market conditions, because when prices go up and stay up, the tenant benefits. If prices go down and stay down, the benefits go to the landlord. There also could be switches to a different cultural practice by the tenant. Say more, they've been conventional tillage, They could be switching over to a no or low till system, and obviously their cost structure will change, and it may impact as to what the tenant can afford to pay. So in comparison to a cash lease and those pros and cons, maybe they can also check into a share lease agreement. And this is essentially where the landlord and tenant share proportionally in the cost and risk of production, and then they share in those returns accordingly. And while the tenant may give up some of that risk, they also give up some of that decision-making power that they had in a cash rental. It may also be annual or multi-year in nature. Typically, a 2/3, 1/3 crop share is found in Oklahoma. The cents per pound gain on wheat pasture, small grains pasture, that's fairly representative of a shared leasing situation. And one important principle is that yield increasing input should be shared in the same percentage as the crop is shared. The reason I'm saying that is that when we don't do that, it encourages a less than optimal use of that input. So what is a yield increasing input? Well, fertilizer is one of those. It has a direct impact on productivity and yields. And so, for example, if we have a tenant that provides all the fertilizer, receives only, say, half or 2/3 of the crop, they're incurring 100% of the cost, but they're only receiving partial benefits. So they'll be inclined to apply less than what they really should be applying in terms of fertilizer. So that's something to keep in mind. I guess the important concept here is that in working up and through an equitable share arrangement, it's a good idea that both parties should determine the percent contribution of the items that they're willing to devote to that production activity. And so when they determine those values of those contributions, then they can share that same proportion in terms of the total returns. And that is really essentially the basic definition of an equitable crop share lease. And so, for example, if a landowner contributes 50% of the total resources by value, that means the operator provides the other 50%, then a 50-50 sharing of the income is a fairly equitable agreement. Obviously, deviations from that, depending on new technologies, improvements, that impacts the resources that are provided by each party, and then that may impact, obviously, the willingness to share total returns in that same proportion. And also, it's a good idea to compensate tenants at the end of the lease for an unused portion of investment. So, for example, if we have a tenant that is applying lime, and that does have the year benefits because it's impacting those yields not only in the year of application, but years, say, 3 or 5 down the road. And for a reason of, whatever reason that they vacate that leasing agreement, then it may be a good idea for some compensation to the tenant to be received because they didn't receive a full benefit from that investment. And so it's something to be thought about and considered in those situations. There are some advantages when it comes to these share rentals. For the landlord, well, they receive the benefit of good prices and yields from good years. And so if wheat goes up to $6, $7 for the upcoming year, hey, they win. For the tenant, they're probably paying less, chances are they are, than if they were farming on their own like a cash lease. But, that does come at a price. And the price is that a lot more communication is required. And so it's not necessarily day to day, but when it's really some crunch times in that production activity, could be planting, could be during the time of harvest, could be the time of, say, pesticide applications, the parties really need to be in touch with each other in terms of what needs to be done, because they're sharing in some cost here. And so They really need to be discussing the cultural practices and determining what needs to be done when. And also, there is some additional financial and production record keeping required. And so that's not a fan favorite, of either landlord and tenant, but it is required, and it's really it is a necessity to make a share lease work, because there's some sharing of costs, and so the parties need to know what those costs are, and they need to be shared. And I mean, those records need to be shared with each other. And so once the parties really determine, that equitable agreement, cash or crop shares, it should be put in writing. I think it really does protect both parties, and it allows for clear communication between them. It helps both parties understand their rights and privileges and duties, and it can help resolve many disagreements before they even start. So, we have a situation where, one of the parties should die. Well, it does provide a guide for the heirs in terms of how that lease has been operated under. And the agreements also should be carefully reviewed each year to ensure that the terms of the agreement are still applicable and desirable. So once again, this agreement can serve as that memorandum of understanding, and it does serve as that documentation for tax purposes. I think your tax preparer will greatly appreciate something in writing, and also consult with an attorney as needed. If there's some disagreement, if there's something left out of the lease that we really don't know how to address, then consult with some legal counsel that is familiar with production agriculture. I know it's an investment up front, but I think it can save or make both parties some expense, some revenues down the road in regards to really saving or making them some money, because it can help, alleviate some of that stress, answer some of those questions, and save some pain really in their back pocketbook. So it is an investment, but I think it can certainly pay some dividends by visiting with some legal counsel. So let's move on to some additional resources that I think that can save you some time and expense also, and can help you do your homework. So the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension fact sheets with the current reports 216 and 230 does contain those market rate information rates, and then also the tax aspects of leasing, also a good source of information. And then when we move on to the OSU Ag Land Lease website and the North Central Farm Management Committee website, I think those are great sources of information, because they're a clearinghouse for, say, some farm management spreadsheet tools, lease information and forms, legal and tax considerations, and of course the KC Fed and USD NAS are some additional sources of information on those market rates. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. Hopefully I gave you some good information that will help you in determining maybe what lease to pursue, and also the base discussion points to which to get started with the going market rates. I think that's a good place to start. And please click on the survey link down below. It allows us to make a good product even better. And so please include your comments in that. And we want to continue delivering the goods to you. And so short of any questions, I'll turn the mic back over to Brent, but I really appreciate your time and the attention on this particular topic, and have a good rest of the day. Take it away, Brent.
Thank you, Roger. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. And I also pasted the survey link into the chat box, so you can click on it there as well. I see a question from Matt, Roger. It says, is there a good place to find available land for lease?
Well, that's a good question. You could probably visit with, you can hang around the coffee shop, and that may come up, in the conversations. But if you have an ag lender, he or she may have some information on some land available to lease. Actually, any ag lender probably would have some information on some land that could be leased. And I would suspect that a number of realtors that deal in agricultural real estate would also have a pretty good feel as to some parcels that are available for leasing. So maybe those are some good starting sources of information to answer that question.
Thank you, Matt, for asking a good question like that. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I thank you for helping us with the feedback by filling out the survey. And our next webinar will be on March 24th, and we will cover the Oklahoma Ag Mediation Program. So we will see you then. So until then, goodbye.